So let's talk a little bit about the neuroscience of depression. Now, the neuroscience of depression is a super complicated topic, and researchers will spend their entire lives studying it and still barely learn just a tiny amount of information. So what we're going to do today is focus on one really exciting new development in the neuroscience of depression that I think also helps us understand a lot about how meditation works and sort of what's going on inside the mind of someone who has depression. So there's been a lot of recent research into something called the default mode network, or DMN. And what people have discovered is that there's this particular circuit in our brain that grants us the capacity of self-awareness. So if we think about humans and we think about animals, like what's the big difference between people and animals? The big difference is the capacity for self-awareness, to think about ourselves. We all have thoughts and feelings and experiences, and what really separates humans from everyone else is our ability to look at our own thoughts, right? I can have a thought over here, and animals have thoughts too, presumably, right? So they're thinking about finding food and whatnot, but then humans have this special capacity where I can stand over here and look at my thinking. And that capacity is basically what's given to us by the default mode network. Now, at this point, you're probably wondering, what does this have to do with depression? And it's a fantastic question. And essentially, what happens in depression is that the default mode network goes haywire and becomes hyperactive. And that may sound a little bit confusing, but if you really think about the mind of a depressed person, and if you've suffered from depression, you may sort of recognize this, that in the mind of a depressed person, you get stuck thinking about yourself. So this is kind of a situation where the world is giving you lots of stimuli, and generally speaking, our mind strikes a balance between kind of thinking about ourselves and thinking about the external world, right? If I think about going to a party, for a healthy person, I may go to a party and other people will smile when they see me. So I'll use that external stimuli and sort of think about that, focus on that, and I'll become comfortable being at the party. For someone who has a default mode network that's hyperactive, they don't quite have that response because their mind sort of pushes away external stimuli, and instead what they do is their mind is running a constant commentary about themselves. So if you think about your experience in depression, or maybe you've seen friends who have had depression, what you'll find is that people are stuck thinking about themselves and thinking negative things about themselves. And we can also see that if you have a friend with depression, for example, you can try to reassure them, but what do they do with that reassurance? They kind of swat it away, they ignore it. And maybe people have tried to reassure you too and told you that, hey, everything's gonna be okay. Hey, I think you're a wonderful person. Hey, I enjoy being your friend. And if you really pay attention to what happens in your mind kind of swats those thoughts away. It pushes them away because your mind is stuck thinking about yourself. And this is the thing that I want y'all to really understand, is that that's not your fault. It's literally there is a circuit in your brain which is looking at yourself, which has become hyperactive. So it's neuroscientifically very difficult or even impossible to stop looking at yourself while that circuit is active. And so then the question becomes, or sort of the most natural conclusion becomes, well, if this circuit of the brain has become hyperactive, and if this hyperactivity leads to depression, if our depression is sort of us constantly thinking negative thoughts about ourselves, it should logically follow that if I can magically flip a switch and turn off that circuit, then depression should get better. And this is the really cool thing, is that recent advances in psychiatry have discovered this exact thing. So there's a very novel treatment for depression, which also works for treatment refractory depression, called ketamine. Now, ketamine, you got to be a little bit careful because it's actually a drug of abuse, has fines and stuff in many parts of the world, is a dissociative agent. So what it allows people to do is kind of unplug from their life. So when people suffer a lot, what they do is they'll get high on ketamine, and then all of their problems, which are kind of swirling around them and they're caught up in, kind of they pull the plug on those problems. And so they kind of dissociate from themselves, and it gives them sort of a sense of peace. And what we find is that when you give someone with depression ketamine, it shuts off their default mode network and gets them to have a little bit distance from themselves, and actually results in them feeling less depressed. And ketamine can actually make people feel less depressed within hours. So there's good evidence that artificially shutting off the default mode network actually improves depression. The problem with ketamine, though, is that one is that it is a substance of abuse, but the second is that when the ketamine wears off, the default mode network can reactivate. So then the next logical question becomes, okay, if ketamine works great and we can artificially shut off the default mode network, then is there some way to permanently shut it off or keep it toned down on a more daily sense? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. And the way that you do that is through meditation. So there have also been some really fascinating studies which have shown that meditation actually shuts down this default mode network in our brain. And if we think about it from sort of the yogic perspective, yogis who have been talking about how good it is to meditate have been saying for thousands of years that one of the benefits and one of the goals of meditation is to develop something called vairagya. Vairagya is the Sanskrit word for detachment. So as we meditate more and more, we literally train our minds to detach. And if you think about a friend of yours who's suffering, what do you say to them, maybe after a breakup, to try to get them to feel less pain, right? What we tell them is take a step back. Don't be so caught up in yourself. Hey, there are other fish in the sea. You're trying to get them to detach from the pain of that moment, detach from the swirling awfulness that is their life in that second, and take a big picture. And when you encourage people to do that, it may not work very well, or sometimes it takes some work. You got to chip away at them, right, to get them to really think that way. And when it does work, that's when the default mode network switches off. And when the default mode network switches off, they start to think about other things. They're not caught up in themselves. And so the cool thing is that meditation is the systematic process of training your brain to shut your default mode network off. When you meditate on a regular basis, you begin to develop this capacity called vairagya. And then we can also see why people who meditate for a long period of time will say, yeah, I'm just happier day to day. And if we tunnel down into it, what is it that these people are able to do? They're able to take a step back from their kind of focus on themselves. They're able to look at external stimuli. They're able to appreciate the outside world. And so that actually leads to relief. So in summary, the default mode network is a really critical part of depression. It's actually sort of the price that we pay, bizarrely from an evolutionary perspective, of having the capacity of self-awareness. Because any circuit in our mind can become hyperactive or hypoactive. So as human beings evolved, we developed this cool circuit in the brain that lets us look at ourselves and think critically about ourselves. And when that network goes haywire, we wind up depressed. We can also find that recent novel treatments in depression that shut off this circuit actually do effectively reduce our depression. So we kind of know that shutting off the default mode network actually works as a treatment. And then the next thing that we can also understand is that those treatments may be temporary, but there's a permanent way to get better control over your default mode network, and that is meditation. Do I have enough headroom now?
Yes, ma'am.
Do I have enough headroom?
Yes, you do.
Okay.
Do you though?
I feel like it's all empty in here.